Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Frontiers of Research, the podcast that brings you some of the hottest science in Europe. Today, we're going to be looking at what happens when science finds itself at the top of the news agenda and when researchers are propelled from their labs into TV studios. I'm your host, Tony Lockett, Head of Communication at the European Research Council. And I'm joined today in our studio by Marius Gilbert, an epidemiologist based at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, also vice-rector of the university. And during the COVID pandemic, Marius appeared regularly in Belgian media, and he was also invited to join an expert group that advised the government during the pandemic. He's written a book about his experiences called Juste un passage au JT, just an appearance on the TV news, I guess would be more or less the translation. And Marius also continues to contribute regularly to the Belgian media, including Le Soir newspaper. Thanks very much for joining us, Marius.
Thanks for welcoming me and hosting me.
Can you remember the first time you ever found yourself in front of a journalist asking you questions?
I remember a couple of papers that led to some TV interviews, but I was at the time very frustrated as a scientist by how brief those interventions are, because as scientists, you always want to express, what led to you to the conclusion, the complexity of the problem that is at stake, and everything got shrinked in a 2-minute sequence that was on the news. So this was somewhat of a frustrating experience at the time, and I wasn't really prepared to that. I was never really satisfied with the result, to be frank.
And perhaps it would be good for our listeners if you just told us a bit about your field of research, because I think you're part of a community of researchers who've been working for many years before COVID on different kinds of transmissible diseases, avian flu, SARS, MERS, etc.
My main field of research is highly pathogenic avian influenza, which is a disease that primarily affects poultry birds, but that has this zoonotic and pandemic potential. So from time to time, those viruses can infect humans, and the people who are infected are in high proportion the ones that were reported dying from the diseases. But there's no transmission from people to people, and there's always been this potential pandemic risk that with some reassortment or evolutionary processes, the virus may acquire the capacity to transmit from people to people and becoming a very dangerous virus leading to a new pandemic. And there's been quite some recent development in the field. But I've been working on that since 2003, so over 20 years. And it's part of those zoonoses and part of those pathogens that sometimes can jump the species barrier to become a problem for people. And there's a number of emerging infectious diseases that are, that have these characteristics of being zoonotic at the origin, including SARS-CoV-2. So there is indeed a community of people working in emerging infectious diseases who have been looking at that over time and the links with global change in general. So looking at what are the factors in terms of not only climate, but also changes in land use, change in mobility, change in demography, change in poultry or production systems that may have led to the emergences of some of those diseases. So clearly when SARS-CoV-2 emerged, I remember my first reaction was a worry that it may be an avian influenza, because Southeastern China is an area for many reasons where there's been lots of those human cases. And the irony is that I was somewhat reassured to know it wasn't avian influenza, because this really was my fear.
Yeah. In those early months of 2020, so you're a researcher, you've been working in your field for almost 20 years, and COVID comes along. And in terms of the kind of level of media interest, and in particular how it draws you in, what changed?
When the virus emerged in Southeastern China, as you know, I had lots of collaborators in Asia linked to my previous collaboration on H5N1. So I knew what was the context, what was happening. So I had those first contacts, and then the media, how they work, they find what they call a good client. And a good client from the media perspective is someone who's clearly knowledgeable about a particular topic, who can express things in clear terms and accessible terms to a wide audience, who is available, to speak, and who's not afraid of speaking in public and speaking in front of that. So very quickly, I became a good client. And then when the pandemic approached our countries, I was somehow already a kind of a public figure who had been explaining the gradual spread of the virus from China, into Italy and further north into Belgium. So that's how I got into this.
In your book, I think you describe one experience where you were called up to appear on the evening news on the RTBF, and you brought your teenage daughter along with you because I think you assumed it would be a relatively quick appearance, and then the evening dragged on because there was a kind of government meeting and the press conference was being delayed. Can you describe a little bit that?
Yeah, I mean, this is really a turning point in terms of my role as in the media, because it was the evening when the government decided to enter into lockdown. The decision took a very long time. So the meeting of the Conseil National de Sécurité at the time, as it was called, was supposed to finish around 7 or 7:30, which is the time of the national news on TV. So I was called by the journalist and could you please come, to make a 2 or 3 minutes comment of the decision. So I came, and I was with my doctor that evening. I told us, join me. It's only going to take 3 minutes, and then we're back and we can have dinner together. So we came, but the meeting lasted and lasted. So instead of being just a 3 minute interview at the end of the news, it became a live emission that lasted 3 hours. But even for the journalists, they had to improvise new content because clearly they felt that something was happening, something that would be very important for the country. So they abandoned the idea of the alternative program that was supposed to be broadcasted that evening. We were live on TV, having to fill the time, in other words. So it was quite a fascinating evening, in fact, because during 3 hours, the journalists, they had to fill the time. So they asked a lot of questions about how science works, what's the role of experts. So we went through lots of very general questions about science at a completely unusual time for a science kind of program. And then the evening became more and more dramatic as people felt that something important was happening. And in terms of audience, it's reached, some of the peak audience in terms of the people who were watching it. And at the end, there was the announcement that Belgium was entering lockdown that, led to this kind of a dramatic moment. And by the time it was finished, my doctor had decided to go home and order pizzas because, evening dinner was over.
And as a good client, you were then invited back very frequently. You found yourself increasingly, I think, over the following weeks and months being asked to comment or appear in news programs. How did that affect you personally? And, what about your friends, your family, your colleagues? Did it change the way they looked at you, do you think, at the time?
In the beginning, I didn't realize it at all because we were in lockdown. So by definition, I didn't see anyone. So almost every day at the time, I was, going to the TV studio, doing the interview and then going back home. We barely did, we did just a little bit of shopping. So I didn't realize the level of exposure. I didn't realize at the time that I was entering day by day people's daily lives at a very anxious time. And that eventually this would lead to a very, very strong bond with the public. And I realized that when several weeks after, suddenly, gradually the lockdown was lifted and we were able to resume our normal activities, suddenly I realized that everyone would recognize me. I think I had tried to find a voice that was not too stimulated too much anxiety, but at the same time making people realize the importance of what was happening and trying to trigger vigilance rather than fear.
You describe it in your book as, I think, treading a tightrope, fil de funambule. Yeah. Is that what you mean, this balance between making sure that people take things seriously but not adding to anxiety?
That's exactly. And you can clearly see that some people were having this kind of narrative, this is not worse than a flu. And if you consider this is not worse than the flu, then why should you take any precautionary measure? Let's treat it like a normal infection. And this was a bit of an irresponsible way of communicating about this.
Can we talk for a moment about social media? Because I know in the early stages of the pandemic, you actually found Twitter, as it was known then, to be quite useful in terms of gathering information and hearing a little bit what was going on in China and other. But then more recently, in November last year, 2023, I know that your university took a policy decision to stop using X, as it's now known, and you personally are no longer posting there. Apart from the specifics of that platform, do you think, on balance, social media is a good thing for communicating science, or is it a danger because of the spread of disinformation, misinformation? What's your view?
Twitter, in the first days, I was really using as a site. It was a fantastic tool to be, at the front line, and by following colleagues, other scientists, to collect what's the latest information we have. Also at different points in the pandemic, there was hundreds of papers that were published, but the one that were the most important ones really surfaced very well on Twitter. So by following a few key scientists, you could really have lots of shared knowledge. So it was very useful. So that was a first use. The second use, and I used it a lot during the pandemic, is that it was a complementary tool to my own communication. During news interview, you have 2 to 3 minutes to present something, to make a comment on something. You don't have the space to present data. You don't have the space to present graphics. You don't have the space to comment a particular paper or result. So I was complementing my media intervention by threads on Twitter, where I was making my own graphics about the situation in Belgium, sharing some key papers that were coming out that I felt were important to communicate with the public. So it was very complementary. I even used it at one point in the pandemic to try to really raise the awareness and a signal of cautiousness during the second wave, and make even a call to the influencer through the social media. But I think it's also a double-edged sword. That's the difficulty with it, because it is a space also where you have lots of alternative narratives that spread out very, very easily. And we should remain present as scientists with narratives that are backed by robust evidences, data, and papers. And clearly, when we communicate on social networks, it's very important to refer to those data, those evidences, to show how other scientists will build evidence. And that's a very important thing. Now, leaving X was also a personal decision, because I simply felt that the value of X were no longer compatible with my own vision of progress, of what is progress. Certainly, regarding the hate speech, there's been lots of strong evidence showing that the hate speech was spreading far more under X than under Twitter, and that nothing was done about it. And I thought that as a scientist, it's no longer acceptable with my own content to contribute to the value of X, and I prefer to contribute to the value of other social networks.
I know that scientists working on health issues, especially around vaccines and other issues that were controversial during the pandemic, but also climate scientists and scientists working on other hot topics, they do experience abuse on social media. From your experience, would you have any advice for people who might find themselves in that situation in terms of how to cope with it?
The first thing is one has to have a little bit of a thick skin and realize that we cannot take the comments that are on social networks as we would take a comment that is done by voice. We should put more distance with those. But the tip I used, and that worked quite well, is to try to avoid the argument of authority. Whenever you try to say, trust me, the kind of trust me, I'm an expert, it simply doesn't work. You have to treat people with respect, and you have to accept that their own understanding of the situation might be different, that they're starting from a completely different ground, that they could come from within an environment with lots of disinformation. And if you have the time, try to explain, one by one, why you simply disagree. There's no problem with disagreeing with someone, as long as you treat the people with respect. And of course, if people don't treat you with respect in return, there's no reason for continuing the conversation. You can block people, you can, interrupt that, not obliged to do that. There's been many occasions where, the first contact was a little bit brutal or a little bit strong. And then I engage in the conversation, say, hello, sir, I hear that, and I was trying to explain things one by one. And then in the follow-up conversation, not always led to being, to agree, but at least there was, again, a kind of a real conversation and some level of respect starting to build. So that's what was my first rule. The second rule that I apply to myself is that very quickly this can take all of your time. I was responding only when my response would be of broader use than only that person I was responding to. So if, in other words, if this was of value, if I thought that through that response, I could communicate about something important and wider to the broader community that reads things on social network. And from that perspective, I found Twitter a lot more useful than Facebook, for example, because in Facebook, you only, respond to a particular comment, and what you have in a post is not read by so many people. Whereas on Twitter, what you respond is read potentially by your entire community of followers, provided that the filters, make it visible to them.
I have a couple of questions following up on what you just mentioned. One is about time, because you mentioned that it takes time. One of the things that we hear very regularly when we talk to researchers who have ERC grants, or when we talk to our colleagues in communication departments in universities and research institutions, is that they sometimes struggle to incentivize researchers to devote time to public engagement and science communication because of the way research careers work and the kind of incentive structure, the kind of publish or perish culture, especially for younger researchers. I know, that's something that you have views about as well, but what arguments would you give to other researchers and scientists that it's worth their time to invest?
Our role is changing, simply. There's lots of societal challenges, whether it is climatic, biodiversity, environment, energy, transition. All of those things have science at the heart of them. And they become major societal issues. So I really feel that our role is changing, that it's not only to produce knowledge, but we should engage in disseminating this knowledge more widely. And partly, I also feel we owe that to society. Most of the researchers are paid by public money, and most of the researchers love their work, they love what they do, and it's a fantastic opportunity to be able to do that and to be paid for what you love doing most of the time. But at the same time, society needs that kind of engagement and feedback to better inform societal decisions. So I really think it's important for researchers to engage into that. Now, I'm fully aware that the incentives are not there, and that maybe we've been a little bit too far in the publish or perish kind of culture. But this is really changing. And, there is the Coalition for the Reform of the Research Assessment that has been signed by many, many organizations in Europe, and that really recognize that we should move a little bit away from all those, quantitative metrics of impact and enter a space where there's a lot more qualitative assessment, but also a recognition of a much wider set of outputs that researchers produce when it comes to open science, when it comes to public engagement, when it comes to communication. And I think this is opening a space where researchers can value, those that are interested in doing that, may value the time they do that. So, but here too, I'd like to give a nuanced view on that. I think that some researchers are extraordinary researchers, but not necessarily good communicators. Forcing them to do communication beyond their nature or what they like to do is not probably a good idea. So I don't consider that every researcher should necessarily do that. But those who enjoy doing it, those who are prepared to do it, shouldn't be disadvantaged for the time they spent on doing it compared to others who are spending that time in producing new paper. So that's what I think is at stake. We should encourage those who are prepared to do it, who enjoy doing it, because those can become excellent ambassadors, not only for science results, but also for science processes and for an evidence-based society that is so important at this time in history.
And you mentioned processes, and you also referred earlier on to the scientific method, which inevitably has a certain amount of uncertainty, because that's how science works. New evidence comes along, and then the community evaluates it, and new knowledge emerges, so it's constantly evolving. But if you go back to your experiences during the pandemic, when things were very uncertain and moving very quickly, do you have any particular tips from your experience about how to explain to non-scientists, so to politicians, to the public, to journalists, how science works and why there are never kind of definitive answers to some of these questions?
That was really my first shock or realization, was that as scientists, you are in your daily life surrounded by other scientists and professionals who have, basic knowledge in science. But as soon as you get into the media or you speak to policymakers, for the large majority of people, the last time they've heard about science was in secondary school. And that sometimes it's a long time ago. So unless they have a very specific interest for following science in the news or reading, science articles, etc., that's the latest contact with science. And that contact is mostly about science results. What is a cell? What is an atom? It's basic biology, physics, chemistry, and things like that. And those are presented almost as facts. So they're not familiar with the notion that science is an evolving process, that it is knowledge in motion, that what you say on day 1 can be different from what you say on day 30 because new data have built up that lead you to change your mind. There's a very good example, for example, with vaccination. In the beginning, we thought, based on the first results, based on the first clinical trials, based on the first experience in Israel, that vaccines were efficient to reduce the risk of transmission, and that this could be maintained over time, and that this could really have a very strong impact on preventing the transmission. After a while, new evidences showed that this effect was reducing with time, but that the protective effect in terms of protecting you from the worst kind of COVID was maintaining much longer. So we had to change our narrative, not because we were wrong, but because new data had accumulated that led us to change our narrative. But people, if you're not familiar with this notion that science is evolving, people feel, well, that's a lack of consistency. You said that at that moment, and now you're saying this. So people need to understand how science works. And then another very important example, I think, is that I'm often asked, okay, I don't have a basic knowledge of science. How could I recognize what is a good expert, who I can trust or who I cannot trust on social networks, on the media, or things like that? And it's not always easy. So my tip has always been that when someone as a scientist has this attitude that I am right, all the others are wrong, that should raise an alarm bell in your mind. It's not necessarily wrong, but the first job of a scientist who thinks he has a new truth is to try to convince his peers with new evidences, with data, with a scientific method, not to bypass them and to address directly the public through the social network. So when someone does that, it is problematic by nature. And because what creates a consensus is the fact that data or results get replicated, that a consensus is built around a community of researchers, and that's actually how knowledge evolves in science. So when people don't know that, they may suddenly trust a lonely voice simply because that person, has all the attributes of a scientist, a white coat and a title in a university or research institute, and comes with something that often people want to hear. And so we really have to communicate a lot about the scientific process, how we work, how we build evidence, how things can change over time, how we handle uncertainty, and that it's not because something is uncertain that we cannot take decisions. Because that's another criticism that has been made, well, maybe, for one example is, okay, I'm vaccinated, yet I was infected. Okay, it's reducing your risk, but it doesn't prevent things entirely. So there is an uncertainty there. And people have to accept it. But it's not because there's uncertainty that you shouldn't do it.
Can I ask a very practical question? Because you've had a lot of experience now doing media work, TV, writing for newspapers and so on. Did you have any training for that, or did you just learn it as you went along? I mean, maybe you had a natural aptitude and attraction for that kind of thing.
I didn't have any learning. So I really learned during the crisis. I think most of my experience comes from teaching. Many researchers also teach, and I was teaching biostatistics to students in biology. And by itself, it's not an easy topic. So it helps if you have this kind of pedagogic skills. And I think it's not something that is easy to teach, but it's not impossible. And there's lots of tips that can be shared and recommendations that can be made through media training. So, for example, in our university, we propose that to the researcher who want to engage more into science communication. We have a number of possible training that we propose to them. And sometimes it's also very practical how to place yourself with the camera, and there wasn't time for that.
In the science communication world, there's a bit of a debate about what is more efficient. Is it more efficient to train scientists to communicate better, or to train professional communicators, especially journalists, more about science so that they appreciate the scientific method? Do you have a view about?
I think we need both. I mean, frankly, because they play different role and they have different aptitudes. I think it's important that as I said, some scientists engage themselves, because there's nothing so communicative as a scientist who is passionate by his field, who speaks about it in easily understandable terms. But sometimes it's a long jump, because, for scientists, getting out of their jargon, getting out of their implicit knowledge is difficult. So not all scientists have this capacity to express themselves at the level that is adequate to a certain public. And that's where we need professionals. And journalists, are experts in that. They know how to translate a complex message to a particular type of public. That's their job. And so it's really the interactions between the two that is interesting. But I really think we shouldn't view them as opposing model, but as end. And it's with this complementarity that we can build something interesting. One thing that is, I think, very important to mention here is that both scientists and journalists are two communities for whom facts are incredibly important. The verification of facts. It's at the heart of their work. So they need to help each other. And I really think that there is a societal issue here that those two communities need to speak to each other much more intensively to protect the notions of facts against, all kinds of movements, sometimes political movements that are attacked on fact or evidence-based decision-making.
In your book, you say that you realized quite early on in the pandemic that the most valuable contribution you could make was going to be to help people understand better what was going on. Looking back now, you feel satisfied that you were able to do that? Is there anything that you would do differently if you could kind of transport yourself back to the early days of the pandemic? And are there any kind of lessons learned that you could share?
I think that there are different times, and the role we play as scientists depend on times. That time was a crisis time. And at that particular time, having another paper on COVID, on epidemiology, was less important than helping society understanding what was happening. So I felt, this is where I should be. This is how I can be the most useful. After a while, when things normalize, when things are less in the crisis term, sometimes you can can divide the role. Some people could be more involved in communication, some people can be back to research. So my own role as being either in the media or being part of expert group or being back to science or part of the university authorities has always been driven by, where do I feel I'm most useful now? And where also do I have some capacity to do things well and enjoying them? Because it's also important to enjoy things in life. But at that time, it was really driven by necessity. Now, thinking backward, there's lots of things that we can evaluate retrospectively, either individually or collectively. But it's so easy to get biased in that assessment by the perspective we have now. So I'm a little bit cautious about my own assessment on that. I think what we should certainly learn is the importance of communication, and that you should improvise it in crisis time. Communication, the way they communicate, who communicates, how, is something that we should be prepared carefully in peacetime so that it is ready in times of crisis. Another thing that I think, it's not so much about my own role or communication, but I think in the pandemic, it's an assessment we can make in Belgium, but also in most countries, the public has been left aside from decision-making entirely. And that's really something, it's justified that it works in the short run, but I think in the long run, it doesn't work. Because people feel that very important decisions are made that will impact their daily life. In between experts, they don't know how those experts have been chosen, and politicians who have the democratic legitimacy, but yet they feel completely out of the decision-making. So we should find better mechanisms, and we should identify them in peacetime as well, so that in time of crisis, the voice of the citizens can be better heard and better channeled through the decision-making.
Just a final question to zoom out a bit, not just from the point of view of communication, but more generally. Do you think we've learnt our lessons from the pandemic? At the level of Belgium, Europe, the world, are we better prepared for the next pandemic if one were to come along?
It really depends on the field. I think we've learned a lot about what is needed to be considered a little bit more prepared and ready in terms of diagnostic, in terms of what is needed, to react in vaccines development, the entire chain of events that could go from a new virus is emerging and spreading to, we know facing it and we're reacting in an appropriate term. There's been considerable delay here, and we much better understand how we could shorten up this delay from all angles. Another thing that we've learned through this pandemic is that handling a pandemic relies on human nature. It's not only because you have the biomedical tools or biomedical technology that by the end of the day, the problem is solved. There's lots of other issues, acceptability, engagement with the public. In general, human sciences have been poorly used in this pandemic. So we should much better interact and make use of all the knowledge that is available in humanities in general, in anthropology, sociology, socioeconomics, etc., to be better prepared. And that angle, there are lots of works, but I'm not sure they fully now integrate into pandemic preparedness plans. And I have one very specific example in mind. There was an editorial of Richard Horton on that in the Lancet, where he was saying, SARS-CoV-2, thrives on inequality. It had a much stronger impact on poor people, but it also made them poorer as well. There's lots of studies that have shown that the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities in
educational
the world.
outcomes,
outcomes as well, etc. And yet, addressing inequality is not part of any pre-pandemic preparedness plans. Why not? Why not? Can we start thinking about what makes a society at the societal level better prepared for a pandemic, including socioeconomic variables and dimensions. So that's something I think we could do a little bit, certainly not a little bit, I think we could do better. But in the biomedical world, we've really learned a lot.
Thanks so much, Marius. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
And thanks to everybody who's tuned in and listened to this episode. You can listen to more episodes from our Frontiers of Research podcast series to hear other examples of top science supported by the ERC. We also have several podcast episodes and YouTube videos specifically on science communication, and you can check out the links to those in the show notes from this podcast episode. And if you enjoyed this, please don't hesitate to subscribe, give us a rating, and share the link to our podcast series with your friends and contacts. This makes our work to popularize science so much easier.